Well, welcome. If you're watching this on video, this is our latest edition of HITRUST Secrets, where we break down any kind of HITRUST concepts and help you keep on your HITRUST journey and learn the things that we wish we had known and we had to kind of learn along the way. So I'm Sue Richards and Donna Nodson is here, and we are joined
Hello.
today by Richard Reben.
Reben?
Reben. All right. Got it the first time. And Richard is an assessor. Both Donna and I do compliance readiness, and then Richard is kind of the one that comes behind that. We kind of hopefully clear the path for him in the role that we play, and then Richard comes in and does the validated assessments. And I guess your firm also does some compliance readiness as well, correct?
That's correct. We do some readiness in terms of like mock audits for HITRUST, but we don't do control design or implementation. We don't do policy development or implementation or anything like that. So really all we do is we help an organization evaluate the readiness for an actual validated assessment.
Okay,
Perfect.
that's great. And Susan, I don't know if you do some of the same stuff that I do, because the majority of what I do actually isn't readiness. It's collaboration with clients as they go through the assessment. So it's kind of jumping on board and helping with
being
communications
the facilitator,
and
the
it really is, but from the inside. So that's really kind of my sweet spot, my specialty in terms of guiding the assessment and just helping everybody understand and figure out how to move it forward, because it's like this mountain and everybody seems to get that shell shocked and they don't know where to start.
Exactly.
I call that the Audit Sherpa, by the way.
Okay. Audit Sherpa. There we go.
Donna is
I finally have a qualification. Audit Sherpa.
Yeah, you can be a coach, a cheerleader, or a Sherpa in terms of the the level of interaction you have on an assessment. And a coach is just going to be like, tell you what you need to do, and then the cheerleader is literally just going to be on the sideline, kind of cheering you on. But then the Sherpa is the person that actually puts a lot of it on their back and helps you carry it forward.
Sherpa. That's what I do. Sherpa.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. So go ahead with the first question that you had, because we're going to get into the top 10 corrective actions the top 10 requirements, controls that require corrective actions. But first, we had another question that had come in that you had about samples and how those files are created or generated.
Right. So, and this is, so I am not an assessor, have never been an assessor. That's not part of my background or specialty. And so with that in mind, and this might be explained in assessor training, but I just don't know, how are the sample files, the population files from which samples are selected, how are they defined? Who defines them? Is that HITRUST? Or does HITRUST say this needs sampling and leaves it to the assessors to kind of figure out what samples they should be picking from? And that might be a little bit more custom based on the organization. That I'm just trying to understand that a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. So it can vary depending on what type of testing is being done. For example, if a assessor is relying on internal resources to perform testing, the organization themselves would be presenting the population as well as the sample and then providing evidence associated with that sample. Since we as an assessor firm don't typically work with organizations that are leveraging their own internal assessors, we first collect the population. So we have probably, on a large R2 assessment, there's probably 30 or so populations that we use. So for example, populations of application releases, IT changes, new hires, terminations, all employees, all individuals with remote access to a system, individuals with teleworking capabilities. So first thing we do, one of the first steps in our assessments is we gather all those populations. Because if the organization can't get those populations together and define them very well, their ability to navigate the rest of the engagement is probably not going to be that great. So we use that as a mechanism to evaluate readiness. So for example, if you can give me a list of servers and a list of workstations and a list of people, then chances are you're going to be able to give me all the evidence as well. But if we have trouble getting a list of employees or a list of servers, we could be in for a tough time. And that gives us an early indication of whether or not there might be issues. But to directly answer your question, first we get those populations, and then we use the sampling methodology that we follow within our firm, which is in alignment with the sampling methodology that is defined in the scoring rubric. Thank you for bringing that up, Susan. The scoring rubric actually tells us what appropriate sampling sizes are going to be, but that's pretty much the process we follow. First, we get the population, then we define the sample, and then we begin requesting evidence associated with that sample, whatever it might be, workstations, individuals, changes, vulnerability scans, etc.
Sure. So those are more what I would call straightforward examples within the population files. There's a situation that I came across recently where the assessor was looking for.
Hey, thanks for watching. We really appreciate it.
Almost
if you got value from this episode,
kind of
hit the subscribe button
change
so you don't miss
tickets,
the
but I want to
next
say that very
HITRUST
carefully
secrets.
because it wasn't
We go live
exclusively
every
that.
Thursday at 2
And they
p.m.
were looking for
Central
them to
and
be
dig into
mapped
real-world
to
compliance
not
and security
only in
topics.
scope
And each session
systems,
gets
but
uploaded right
down
here after the
to
live show.
the
So
kind
whether
of
you're
database
catching
and
us
potentially
live or on your
server
own
level,
time, make sure you're
which was
subscribed. We'd love to have you along on your
there's a
HITRUST
lot of
journey.
inheritance in play, and to map the tickets down to that level is just not. It's not something that information system holds. That they work at the main system, especially when you're talking about user tickets and stuff. User errors reported. They're not talking about kind of the deep dive back end tables or servers as far as that goes. So I'm just trying to understand at what point because I don't want to guide clients incorrectly to say, right, well, what the assessor says is Bible and we just have to deliver exactly that. If that's not actually the case, and we should be taking a closer look at what is being requested or required and advocating on behalf of the organization to say, actually, if that's what you're looking for, this is where that's located. Do you know what I mean? I'm trying to effectively guide the process without. I like to balance very carefully to collaborate with the assessors because they're advocating HITRUST, and I'm a big fan of HITRUST. I'm a big fan of the fact that the breach rate is so low, and the requirements are stringent for a reason. So I'm a big fan of HITRUST, but I want to make sure that I'm also helping my clients as effectively as possible. And that might be advocating on their behalf in some circumstances to make sure we're looking in the right spot.
Yeah, so there's a couple things to unpack about this thought there. So one is the assessor's word isn't Bible.
Okay.
Really, the only two things that I would point to that are considered Bible within the HITRUST ecosystem would be, first of all, the scoring rubric is absolutely Bible.
Yep.
The second thing is the requirement itself, and then to some degree, the illustrative procedures. Now, that being said, the other side of that coin is the fact that HITRUST requirements are written in such a manner that they are applicable to a wide variety of environments in a wide variety of organizations in a wide variety of circumstances. So it is not unusual, and organizations should not be surprised if conversation needs to occur in relation to how the organization is demonstrating alignment with a requirement. So, for example, I as assessor might have an understanding of this requirement. I might have an understanding of the environment, and I would say, hey, to demonstrate implementation, well, first of all, I look at the policy and the procedure for an R2. E1 and I1 are a little bit different, but for an R2, I look at the policy and I look at the procedure, and I say to myself, well, if they're doing this, if they're doing what they say in the policy and they're following their process, what evidence should exist that it is successfully implemented? And then I should just be able to ask for that implementation evidence. Now, for an E1 or an I1, it's more my understanding of the environment, my understanding of the tools they use, and what I think they should have. And then I ask for it. But then, if there is any question as to what is needed, that begins that conversation where the client or their advocate, in your case, might say, we won't really do that, but to address the risk associated with this requirement, this is what we do instead. In a perfect world, that's an easy conversation. You change direction, you capture the evidence you need. In a more difficult situation, you might be working with an auditor who is working off too much of a checklist. So they have trouble making the mental shift away from, I need this, into, oh, but they don't have that. Instead, they do this, so they have this. And that's a very important part of the conversation and should be a natural part of any assessment.
Right.
Yeah,
So you answered a few questions there.
because I can see like the original example that you gave, Donna, was a server and changes to that server. So I could see for like patch management, you would probably do it at that server level. But
Yeah.
if you're changing a system that uses that particular server, you probably would also have changes that would be application specific or system specific, and maybe that server got changed or maybe not. It may have been the
Yeah,
data that was on that
in
system.
yeah, in this case, it was very specific to user reported errors, and not general change management tickets, which is why I was a little surprised about the push to go down to the server level, because even somebody who's picking up the phone for customer
Isn't going to
support
know what server
is
name.
not going to know, and they might have technical expertise, but when you get that initial report, you rarely know exactly how that's, how the impact is wired up, even if you're pretty good with system architecture, which normally those types of skill sets are a little bit different from one team to the next. So I was a little bit surprised, but I thought I would check to make sure that I hadn't got, the complete wrong end of the stick there,
Yeah.
and make sure that I understood.
There's a couple ways to dig into it a little bit more. I mean, the first question there is, what's the requirement?
Mm-hmm.
What's the actual language in the requirement? And then if
Yes.
you look at the requirement and you look at the
Mm-hmm.
illustrative procedures and you're still kind of scratching your head, like, I don't really know quite what we're getting at here, then what I do is I start looking at the authoritative mappings.
Yeah.
What are the
Okay.
authoritative mappings associated with that requirement, and are they helping me a little bit more? So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, is there a HIPAA mapping? Is there a CSF mapping? Something
Mm-hmm.
like that that gives me, oh, okay, so we're looking at this, but more specifically, we're looking at this in relation to this NIST requirement or this HIPAA requirement. And
Okay.
I have had situations in the past, it's been a while, where the testing for something was a little bit difficult and it wasn't clear
Mm-hmm.
cut. So what we did is we went back to the authoritative source and we said, oh, well, let's test it in relation to this. And then that came up in QA and we said, well, since it wasn't clear within the requirement how this applied in the environment, we went
Mm-hmm.
back to that authoritative source and we said, okay, are you complying with this? Because if you're complying with that, then you are likely addressing the risk associated with that high trust requirement.
Right. Now, and I appreciate the different, types of mappings and stuff that can go on. The illustrative procedures, in some cases, they're helpful. I found in the vast majority of cases, they are not so illustrative,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
not as illustrative as might be helpful.
yeah, that is correct. And again, it goes back to the fact that the high trust requirements
Hmm.
and the illustrative procedures are intended to meet a wide variety of
Yeah.
environments. So there
Yeah.
is some back and forth. It's not a dictatorial process on behalf of
Okay.
the assessor. It is a collaborative process. Because one of the things I try to reinforce with my clients is I'm not giving you a score. You are assigning yourself a maturity score, and you're saying
Hmm.
we are 100% compliant with all requirements throughout the entire scoped environment. And then
Hmm.
my responsibility as an assessor is say, great, let's take a look at the evidence that justifies that score. So
Hmm.
again, it's a bi-directional process.
Right, of course. And that's been my experience. It's my other experiences with other assessors, I mean, have been much more collaborative. This particular one seems to be um, a little bit more rigid, and I was just curious as to whether or not that was potentially, something that they were getting from high trust, as far as like that is a really hard barrier. And it struck me as a little odd, but I try to, like I said, I try to see the assessor's perspective on things to make sure that I would never want to put them in an awkward position, because I am a huge fan of high trust. And I know that there is a part of the rigidity in the process is what delivers the value. And so that part's
Yeah,
important.
yeah.
So
Absolutely.
anyways, thank you very much.
One thing that can influence an assessor's testing and what they're asking for is if they have gone through a specific, maybe an assessment in the past, and they've gone through
Mhm.
a QA issue where they had a task opened and HITRUST specifically challenged some testing that was performed. I
Mhm.
can say that we as an assessment firm certainly have specific requirements that we look at very closely because we know what HITRUST's interpretation
Mhm.
of that requirement is. And maybe, for example, we think that there's a common amount of misalignment with what
Mhm.
we see versus what HITRUST is expecting to see. And
Yeah.
we certainly communicate as an assessor team and say, hey, for whatever reason, we've seen a number of issues in relation to this requirement recently. We really
Mhm.
need to be addressing this, either this aspect of it, or we need to be looking very closely at this, things like that.
Sure. Sure. That makes sense.
Well, and is it true that there's usually when High Trust QA is doing their review, there's a certain defined subset of controls that come up more frequently in the QA process than others? So
Yeah, so
this assessor may have had a really bad experience with an off cycle assessment, control that came up, and
Sure.
that's where they're kind of having that wartime flashback.
yeah, so typically speaking, the way that my experience with HITRUST is they select a random sample of requirements from throughout the assessment. In addition, they look very closely at any items that are marked as NA. They look at any items that might have a potential quality issue associated with them. There's actually called a PQI. If there's certain language in a
Mhm.
work paper, this MyCSF actually flags it, and you have the ability as the assessor to see that. And for example, if you override that, if you say no, this isn't a PQI, and you still send that work paper written in that way to HITRUST, they're going to look at that one. So they can add additional ones in. And then our recent experience is that there are certain requirements that seem to not so randomly be looked at every time. There's one requirement in the E1 that HITRUST is looking at very carefully these days, and that's the requirement around immutable and offline backups. We have seen that requirement get picked on almost every single one of the E1s that we have done recently. And that's because it's a rather new requirement, and there's a lot of different ways to implement that, and HITRUST is trying to influence how organizations are responding to that requirement and making sure that the bar is where it needs to be for organizations to meet that requirement.
Yeah, and it's also good because I mean that's a basic blocking and tackling type of control to have in place is an immutable backup.
Yeah, and we look at things like that as just that's continuous improvement for us as assessors. When we see that HITRUST is looking at a certain item and saying, hey, we're being, I'm not going to use the language being hard on this one, but when we're taking an extra close look at it each time, we as assessors need to turn around and do that same thing with the assessed entities that we're working with. So for example, when we are doing readiness with a client, we're going to say, hey, this is one item we are definitely going to make sure that we have assessed you against in readiness so that when it comes time for the assessment, there's no question as to whether or not you're compliant with this item.
Yeah, I know. I always have my gotchas of these are the things you need to look at because, like, testing your backup plan because it's something that you may do, you may informally do it, but it's like no, that's something that is going to come up. Is you've got to make sure that you're testing out that plan at least once a year, and a true a, event actually would count as a test because you are actually implementing your recovery strategy. So I do caution them on that. But yeah, there are certain things that I know I've looked at that as I'm doing just even the very beginning to say, make sure you have these before we even start because they're definitely going to be uh, reviewed and cataloged.
Yeah, another great example of a requirement that there's a lot of gray area on, especially from client perspectives, is the requirement that talks about the annual review of inventories for completeness and accuracy. It's very common for us to get into that one, and organizations like, oh, well, we use our change management process, so it's always complete and it's always accurate. Well, that requirement is more audit focused. It's how do you audit it once a year to make sure it's complete and make sure it's accurate. So we kind of have to coach them through that process of that needs to be a separate specific event where you are evaluating the completeness and the accuracy of the inventory and producing some evidence that you're doing that. Because that's the other side of it is they may do it, but do they evidence it very well? Because if they
Yes,
didn't evidence
exactly.
what the outcome of it was, it's kind of like access reviews. If you don't document
Yes,
the outcome of the access review, how are you really verifying that the access review is even performed? If
right.
somebody
Right.
said, I did the review, well, that's great. But as a former systems administrator, I know that on one of those reviews, you always find something.
Right.
So the
Right. And
question
I
is, well,
find,
what did you find?
sorry, I was going to say, I find that the smaller organizations, in particular organizations with no more than, 50 or 100 max employees, are the ones that really struggle with the evidencing because the larger organizations tend to have a bit more formality around those types of reviews and processes. But making sure in the smaller organizations that not only can they prove it, but they try to get somebody else to do that review. So I shouldn't be reviewing my own work. That's not really a check and balance. I need to have somebody else reviewing my work. Even if it's that a person who's a step removed from what that process is, it's making sure that there is proof that there's another review going on. And I encourage clients to use email. If you've got a review and it's happened or a decision that's happened, send that email to the people who were involved in the decision, have them respond in writing so that it's a little bit more of a kind of time date stamp, a little
Hmm.
bit more of a, documentation of that decision or approach or review or something that happened. And I don't know, Richard, if you have additional context or feedback on that kind of an approach.
Yeah. The only thing I would add there is email's great, and it
Mm-hmm.
certainly is a paper trail. But when it comes time for the assessment, organizations often have a hard time finding those emails, which is why
Oh,
we suggest use something like Zendesk or use something like Jira
Yeah,
and
ticketing.
set up
mm,
automations in your
agreed.
ticketing. So, for example, you
Mm-hmm.
can have a workflow in Asana or Jira
Mm-hmm.
or whatever where people sign off on it and there's a checkbox, and it also
Absolutely.
generates a paper trail. Um, but I agree. Smaller organizations, it is often a little bit harder. But at the same time, big organizations have a hard time with some of those controls as well because they get so big. And then it becomes an
Yes.
issue of like, they have a hard time with access controls because it's like, I don't even know what to do. I have to email all these people and they never respond to me. So I don't know what to do. And it's like, well, then you have to put more of a tool focused approach in place
Mm-hmm.
and it's going to require a lot more actual monitoring of the control.
Right. I'm absolutely a big fan of tools and dashboards, even SharePoint dashboards. Super simple. Most people have SharePoint. They've
Yeah.
got a Microsoft, solution in place, and they're really easy to put in place. And people often overlook an already in-house and available solution. So yeah, I completely agree. It'd be great to get it out of email. I still find some of the smaller clients struggle.
Yeah. And the great part about, for example, using a ticketing platform like Jira or Zendesk or anything else is
Hmm.
you can typically create different ticket types.
Yes.
So, for
Yeah.
example, if you have ticket types for incidents, or you have ticket
Hmm.
types for changes, or ticket types for whatever it might
Access
be,
reviews. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
when it comes time
Yep.
for the audit, you just give me a query and here's all the tickets, and it's much easier to
Yeah.
find them rather than digging through a haystack and be like, I know I did that access review in the beginning of March, but I don't
Who did
remember
I
the
Yeah.
send it
exact
to?
day.
And yeah,
Yeah.
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 And then the
Yeah.
other problem there is if you have any turnover in the organization, potentially you might lose some of that documentation if everything's in email. Whereas if it's in a ticketing
Yeah.
system,
Agreed.
it's not going to go anywhere.
Yep,
Well, hopefully it doesn't
absolutely.
go anywhere.
Excellent. All right. So did we want to, Stephen, did you have any questions? Or we were just going to go through the top 10 controls that require caps?
Nope, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Absolutely. All right. Let me share my screen again. And now, Richard, you had said that you had created, I think it was LinkedIn posts on all of these, right?
Yep.
All right. So the first one kind of makes sense. The periodic review of service level agreements. And I know I found that when I was at a large organization, we didn't, from an information security team perspective, necessarily do this because that vendor relationship belongs to the business owner. We were expecting that business owner, as part of their uh, process, working with a vendor, would review service level agreements. And I guess from a business perspective, they typically don't do that unless there's a problem with the service level agreement, in which case then they'll review it with their vendor to say, hey, you're not meeting our expectations. But if everything's going along smoothly, they're not necessarily doing a formal review quarterly or whatever of their SLAs. Is that what you're finding?
So I was just pulling up my notes in relationship to this one. And so first of all, this specific requirement isn't found in an E1. So this is a requirement that's found in the I1 or the R2. So it's something that more mature information security programs should include. The first one is there's a lot of monitoring that has to occur to be able to successfully implement this requirement. So for example, first of all, you have to have SLAs, you have to collect them, and then you have to have some sort of mechanism to be monitoring service performance such that you can actually verify compliance with that. And I think that's what organizations are often lacking, is they don't really have the measurable capability in place to look at an SLA and say, oh, this vendor is or isn't compliant. And since this item is not in E1s, but it is in I1s and R2s, it's one of those ones where organizations may elect to not implement because they don't need it from a score standpoint. And then the other possibility is just the organization might do it, but they don't retain appropriate evidence. What was the conclusion from that comparison that they're supposed to be performing?
Right. But if this is requiring a corrective action, then there's obviously something they need to. I mean, are you thinking that they're just going to say, we accept that risk, and the corrective action is basically we accept it and life goes on?
Yeah, either that, or for example, if they're going through an assessment for the first time, their corrective action plan might be to go do this.
Right. But yeah, it is a lot of formality to put in place for vendor relationships, especially when you have a lot of third parties. And that's part of it. Is I don't think this is necessarily ranked to like network service providers only or something like that. It's not necessarily your critical vendors. I think it's pretty it is widespread to all of your different vendors. I don't think it's necessarily that network services.
Well, at a minimum, the way that we would look at this is any organizations that are listed in your services outsourced component of your scope would definitely be looked at right here. So when and again, this is a good example. We started off this conversation talking about sampling. During the beginning of the assessment, we would have captured the full list of in-scope vendors, and we might sample that. And then for this item, we might say, okay, for this sample of vendors, show me that you did this. Now, some vendors, an SLA isn't reasonable or it isn't relevant to the service that they provide, but in some cases it is.
Okay. So if you picked a sample of vendors that maybe half of them it's not relevant, maybe they're outsourcing code development or something like that, so they're still part of the information system, but not necessarily in an SLA, typical IT infrastructure type of model. Do you mark those as NA, or does that assessed organization basically start at 50% and can't go higher?
No, what we would do, so for example, you don't take a deficiency just because something isn't relevant.
Okay.
First thing we would do is we would replace that selection within the sample.
Okay.
And then if there aren't enough to replace it, well, then you just say, okay, for the number where it is relevant, have they been doing it? We don't reduce a score simply because they don't have a certain number of relevant cases to evaluate. Okay. But what we do have to do is if we say it's not relevant for this one, we will put into our testing and our documentation how we determined it wasn't relevant. Why is it not relevant? So that way when the QA analyst sees it, they can see that we went through that evaluation and we considered that as part of our testing. If we don't include that, the QA analysts come back and say, well, why does your sample only have 2?
Half of your of your
Yeah,
selection.
so we make sure that we put in that additional documentation around how
Okay.
we made that determination.
Perfect. All right. Anybody have questions on the first one? All right. And then network protection. And again, this is probably, especially for smaller organizations, this is probably difficult to do because you're basically going to be getting the network service as the network service provider deems it to you. And you're not necessarily going to be able to provide, provisions in your contract that says, hey, I have the right to audit you. And
yeah, right to audit is a difficult one to put in there, especially when you're a taker in a contract situation. For example, if you're working with AWS or another major cloud service provider and you're a small shop, they're not going to give you a custom agreement. You're going to have the standard agreement. The other thing that I pointed out here in looking at this one is this is another case where if cybersecurity or governance is too far removed from the acquisition process from a vendor selection standpoint, they might not have the seat at the table to say, hey, this agreement needs to include these things. So what happens is a lot of time governance and cyber, they're just going to receive this agreement after it's already been signed and somebody's saying, hey, go implement this. And they look at this agreement, they're like, well, why didn't you talk to me first? And that makes this one a little bit problematic from that standpoint. And again, this is one that is not included in E1 assessments. It's only found in I1 and R2 assessments. So again, it's a more mature information security program control.
okay. All right. And then the next one, audit logging. Now, sounds like one that it should be pretty easy to specify, because audit logging and monitoring is typically under the purview of your information security organization. So having that conversation as a compliance person to your InfoSec team should be pretty easy to say, hey, we definitely need to have, how our procedures need to say what it is we're doing, how often, and kind of follow these parameters pretty easily. So this kind of seems like one that it's good to be aware of it so that you can prevent this from being one of the top three.
Yeah, and it's funny because this item looks like it should be a bit of a softball requirement because all you're doing is documentation. It's have you specified, have you put in writing how these things work. But what we commonly see organizations miss in relation to this requirement is evaluative elements 3 and 4. How often reviews are done, how the reviews are documented, that could be documented pretty easily. That's pretty common to see in a logging and monitoring policy. But then 3 and 4, the roles and responsibilities of the personnel conducting the reviews. And then 4, the professional certifications or other qualifications required. Organizations simply just don't document that stuff sometimes. So even going through readiness, maybe they've kind of looked at this at a high level and be like, oh yeah, roles and responsibilities are covered in our InfoSec policy. But it doesn't cover that specifically in relation to log review. So that's where I can easily see organizations taking a 50% on this one because they didn't do 2 of the 4 evaluative elements. And from an assessor standpoint, policy and procedure deficiencies, which in this case carry into implementation, because if you don't document it, you didn't implement it. So at that point, these are cut and dry, black and white. It's either it's in there or it's not.
Yep, makes sense. All right, vulnerability management. Now this is a big one, 11 components making up this one. So I can imagine where, it's the nitpicky requirements here that catch people. What are you seeing?
Yeah, this one is in I1 and R2 assessments. It's not found within the E1. And in this case, because it has so many evaluative elements, I've got to believe that this is an all or nothing item. Either organizations included these things or they didn't, or they're unable to evidence it, if that makes sense. So I think a lot of organizations, they may have like a software development lifecycle document, but these things, for whatever reason, aren't specifically mentioned.
Right. Well, I mean, it may, because I know the software development lifecycle documents that I've created before will say OWASP top 10 or something like that, but they don't necessarily go into each one of these because it says any other input validation in the OWASP top 10. So, and there's 11 things here. So it's like,
Yeah.
to me, I kind of look at this and go, because the OWASP top 10 kind of evolves over time anyway, it almost feels like you're going to be kind of outdated if you continue to leave some of these older ones in your software development lifecycle that maybe don't pertain anymore because maybe you're now serverless. And so, there's some of these that you just wouldn't want to put in your SDLC. But
Yeah.
I
And
guess you
I
kind
think,
of still have
again,
to
this
put it in
is,
there just because otherwise it's going to get dinged if you don't.
yeah. And again, this is a great example of an item where it's black and white. It's either it's in your SDLC or it's not. The other element of this is in relation to the specific language. So the organization develops applications based on secure coding guidelines to prevent. So as an assessor, I'm looking for not only an SDLC, but also tools and techniques that are in place within the application development process. And a lot of times, you see organizations, oh, we're very agile, and they just don't have this stuff documented. And they might not be using tools that facilitate all of this. But I think the number one failure is probably the failure to document these practices within your SDLC.
So would it also help with like a code review if your code review had specific things like a checklist that you went down that said, hey, are we making sure that we're not susceptible to these 11 things? Would that help as far as evidencing it? And are there any automated tools that do that?
Well, I mean, there are certainly lots of plugins for IDEs that can do, code analysis as an application is being developed. And yeah, if the control is as simple as we have a peer review checklist, and that peer review checklist includes these components, but as an assessor, I would need to see these components specifically listed, not just we do that during peer review. And then it's like, well, unless you
What
can
do you do
show me,
during peer review?
what
Yeah.
did you do during peer review? If their only evidence is, that's in our peer review process, then
Yeah.
I'll be like, okay, well then show me.
Yeah.
Show me where it is in that
I'll sit
process.
into the next one and
Yeah, and I mean, as an assessor, I could dig a little bit further, and I'd say, okay, that's great. So show me an example where something failed code review because of one of the OWASP top 10 input validation issues. And then they'll be like, oh, I can't find it. I'm like, okay, well,
never fail. Yeah.
that doesn't build confidence that you're
Right.
actually doing it. So it starts with having it within documentation in the policy or SDLC or whatever it might be, and then some mechanisms in place where they can prove that it's being done. So, for example, a static code analysis tool, dynamic code analysis tool as part of the automated code pipeline would be a great way to do this. Again, assuming you've already got it documented as part of your policy and procedure.
Okay. All right. Access control. Yeah, and I think with this one, I don't see a lot of people looking at unsuccessful login attempts. They just kind of let Microsoft or Google kind of handle those unsuccessful login attempts, and they're not really tracking those and reporting on those.
Yeah, again, this item is included in all HITRUST assessments, so it's included in the E1, the I1, and the R2. There's a problematic issue with this requirement in terms of language because it uses the word policy. So is that a technical policy that you enforce with group policy or your MDM solution, or is it a written policy? Well, so first of all, you have to have it documented, and then second of all, you have to have it enforced through a technical control. In my experience, this is one that just organizations, again, they've done so much work modifying their policies and procedures to address the HITRUST requirements that this one sometimes gets missed. Or they're using a tool that doesn't support the implementation of the technical control.
Right. In my experiences have mainly been around the tool and the organizations not necessarily understanding all of the technical details for how the tool is set up, and the third party organization being very reluctant to share that level of detail.
Yeah.
Because obviously it's how the food is made. So the secret sauce, so to speak. So they don't necessarily want to share that, especially if they've never encountered HITRUST before. They don't understand why it's necessary to share it. So I've definitely encountered those types of situations before where it's, digging through and indeed have provided, this is the technical documentation and the information you're looking for is located on page 832. Thank you.
Yeah. And another possibility here, again, going back to scope, is we're not always talking about an identity provider like Okta or Entra, IAD or anything like that. You could be talking about an in-scope web application. Then the question is, well, how are account lockouts handled for that in-scope web application?
Yeah, those are almost easier, I think, because then you can have that conversation with the developers and the software engineers on that team. To me, this is the one where, people are saying, well, we don't do any in-house development. We just let Microsoft handle it or Google handle it. So we don't have a policy about it because our policy is basically, we don't have any in-house developed systems. And, like you said, our group policy is set to the default of, how many unsuccessful log out, attempts before we lock them out. And they're just not being that to that level of detail in a policy document.
Yeah, and that's where the policy should be. Here's what we require from the vendor who handles this for us. Yeah. That way it's documented. So should they ever change the vendor and the next person in that role doesn't know why they chose that vendor in the first place, they at least have some parameters.
Yeah. And it's not one you can inherit. You'd almost want to, be able to say, well, even if you've got things hosted in AWS or something, well, I let AWS handle the unsuccessful login attempts. But there's so little of this that you actually could from just a standard, I use, we're a Windows shop and this is what we use.
The other point to bring up here is this is an access control. That's an extraordinarily large domain in any HITRUST assessment. So again, organizations might look at this one and be like, we can afford to take a point hit on this one. We don't need to worry about it quite so much because it's a very specific requirement. Whereas in an access control, there's a bunch of overlap and other areas that are looked at. This is a very specific thing. It's like account lockout, not just password policies or anything else. It's just very specific to account lockout. So for organizations
that are taking more... But if it's the difference between getting certified or not getting certified, this sounds like it's almost a very straightforward one to kind of implement this control.
And again, most of the ones that are on this list are pretty black and white. It's either it's documented and enforced or it's not. And one of the challenges when you're talking about requirements that have a requirement for documentation is if you haven't documented it in policy, that carries into your procedure, which then carries into your implementation score. So things can go downhill real fast when the requirement is, do you specify? Do you document? Because you'll lose points all across the board by not implementing.
Yeah, that's definitely helpful. All right. So rounding out the last 5 here, we've got another access. Well, we've got a couple more access controls. So logical and physical access authorizations, when there's any change. Yeah, and I think it's the change in responsibility. So many people are looking at termination, but they're not necessarily looking at I've moved from one team to another, or I've increased or decreased my responsibilities on that team.
Yeah, and that perspective is absolutely backed up by my experience working with HITRUST QA. If you do not address changes in employment or responsibility, for example, the moves add changes ticket type, they're probably going to ask about it because a lot of, in my experience, a lot of assessors do focus on, oh, this is all about termination. Well, it's not. But it's about termination and modification. And that modification part is easy to forget. And another issue there is a lot of organizations don't track that stuff very well. So for example, if I go to a client and I say, hey, show me all the tickets that are associated with the modification of user access to resources. Unless there's a specific ticket type for that, they're going to have a hard time digging into those. And it's also hard for us as assessors to establish a population for testing of that. Because how am I supposed to know when there's changes in responsibility or I
Right.
know employment, because if you were terminated, you were terminated. But how do I know who has changed roles during the period? I can go back to HR, but even that doesn't address informal roles and things like that. But that's
Right.
a great example, Stephen.
And
Yeah.
promotions are
Yeah.
a misconception because people oftentimes think if you're promoted, you get access to more systems. But as proper security controls will show, that shouldn't necessarily be the case. Just throwing
Yeah.
that out there.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah. I
if
think,
anything, a lot of cases, promotions, your access might even be less because if you're moving from an
Yes.
operational to a managerial role, you may not need that admin account anymore. Just your team needs that admin account.
right.
So that's a perfect example as well. But again, there's several reasons in relation to this item. And there's a reality here that items can have score deficiencies for a number of reasons, but two primary reasons. A, the client isn't doing the thing, or B, the assessor fails to collect and maintain the appropriate evidence and apply it to HITRUST. So there's two ways that you can lose points on or more than that, but two primary ways. And this is a great example where if an assessor overlooks or doesn't have a mechanism in place to test that, it can result in a loss of points for an organization.
Yeah, I had one client that they were very good about it because it was physical location. So it was somebody moving from one location to another. So their manager would change and all of the access to the patient records that they needed would change. So that was very easy, very straightforward to track those. But a lot of times, especially to Donna, to your point about being promoted or not changing your managers, there's a lag there sometimes between shifting those responsibilities or those old responsibilities that you had. So maybe you were operational, but you're the most technical operational person who's now been promoted to manager. You're typically not going to day one turn off your access because you're still going to have to transition somebody else into doing what you were doing. And then nobody ever looks back to go, oh yeah, I really don't need that admin ID any longer. And that's really, I think, where that one trips up. So this one doesn't surprise me on those changes of responsibility. And then let's see, same one, our next one, number 7, organization reviews accounts and privileges periodically. And yeah, again, that's difficult. You look at it from, okay, the person, but then you also sometimes look at it from the system. Does this person need access to the system any longer? And to have both of those in place and know who those application owners are to be able to say, you have to make the decision. Do these people still need access? Yes or no? And in a large organization, that's really tough to say, you've got 100 different people and you only know half of them. And you're like, well, I don't want to cut access to these people if they really do need it. And I just don't know what team they're in or something.
Yeah, I mean, and imagine like an enterprise type environment where you have thousands of users.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you're using a tool that really helps you facilitate this process in a very formal process, it can be difficult. And again, I think this is a good example of one where deficiencies are often noted because the outcome isn't documented. So what happens is the implementation evidence is very weak because you look at it as an assessor, you're like, great, I can tell you did something, but I don't quite know what you did.
Right. Or did you do it consistently?
Yeah. Now,
that's a big one too.
For example, when you get into the R2s, you also have that requirement around evaluation of access reviews on a quarterly basis, but then admins, it's every 60 days. And that's another one where organizations struggle with. Because, for example, they'll get used to doing a quarterly access review, but then they forget that admin credential requirement is every 60 days. So, and for example, if organizations are only doing this every once a year, maintaining the documentation, making sure somebody is supposed to be doing it and they're following through on that, those things can easily be missed. And a great example here is this is a requirement where if you didn't do it within a timely manner when you were supposed to, you don't have a magic, like you don't have a TARDIS to go back in time and do it when you needed to. Right. You either did it or you didn't do it. And if you didn't do it, well then there's nothing more to be said.
Right. Well, and that's a question now that as how far back does that go? So maybe you are doing a readiness assessment and you go, oh yeah, we need to do this. And so you do it a month before your assessment starts. Does your does your assessor go back to the year prior and say, okay, well, show me where you did it a year ago? Or are they just kind of going, okay, you did it a month ago, we're good?
So unless the requirement specifies some sort of more lengthy retention or execution period, for example, there's requirements that talk about retaining, I believe it's audit outcome for at least 3 years. That's a situation where you say, hey, show me your last 3 years of signed representation letters for your SOC 2 report. That demonstrates that management was involved. They signed off on the audit and things like that. There's also a requirement that talks about system integrity requirements have to be documented, and that's reviewed every 2 years, or no, every year. So yeah, for those we would go as long as it's been done within the past year as of the point of testing.
Okay.
But if at the point of testing it was more than a year ago, then there could be an issue. And it's like, well, then you didn't do it in the past year. So again, it kind of goes back to the fact that within HITRUST you have that 90-day look back, but that's not entirely true because there's plenty of requirements where you go back to say, were you doing this annually? Were you doing this every 2 years or every 3 years? And in those cases, you do look a lot further back. It doesn't require that they've been doing it for 3 years, just that if they implemented HITRUST, that they can go back to that point in time and say, we've been doing it since then.
Yeah. And I think that's easier at that point because first off, you know about the requirement. And second off, you want to continue to keep your certification. So you're going to look at everything that you have to do annually, quarterly, every 60 days in order to maintain that certification. So I think this one I would see was probably be something that more trips up the newer or the initial certifications more so than the recurring ones.
Yeah. And the trust report shows us that organizations over time resolve gaps. They resolve those gaps. They have fewer deficiencies on subsequent assessments.
True. All right. Risk management. We're doing on time. Okay, but 8 minutes left. It's perfect. So formally authorize new information assets and facilities before commencing. And again, that I know that strikes very much to me of like the federal government authority to operate type of formal decision process. And I can imagine that that's not necessarily in a policy and all that.
Yeah. I think the couple of things here, first of all, approving information security assets and facilities for processing before use is tough because if that isn't done, there's no way to go back and magically fix that. Right. And again, if this was an afterthought, that's an issue. The other thing is as an assessor, it's easy to identify instances where this wasn't performed. You're like, hey, I noticed that you stood up this new data center. Hey, I know you stood up this new office. Show me where you did this.
Right.
And unless they were thinking of that as part of the process.
It's impossible when you acquire because you don't have any of that historical information. It's like you just inherited a co-location that they've been operating in for the last 5 years. And you're like, well, I can't show you where we approved other than we approved the merger or the acquisition.
Yeah.
But, there was never a specific, yes, I bless this co-location and say it is, it has the authority to operate.
I'd say in the instance of like an acquisition, I'm not in this to be a gotcha auditor, but I would ask them in that situation, be like, hey, show me what due diligence you did as part of the acquisition. And if they could provide reasonable assurance that they had addressed the risk associated with this requirement, I would probably not penalize them for that. But in a clear-cut case of you were operating, you had already been through a HITRUST assessment, you stood up a new office, you stood up a new data center, you got to have
formal this. Yeah, where's your formal thumbs up? Yeah. And like a go no go decision doesn't count like on a change management. That's not what they're saying here. It's not like 10 people said go, we're ready to go live. It's definitely more of a management saying yes, we approve of the way you've implemented this.
Yeah, not only that, but you have to review and update those approvals. So for clients that have been operating data centers for years, you could go back and say, hey, show me the last time you did this. And if it's not within the past 3 years or, if I can't see that cycle, then that could lead to a deficiency as well.
Yeah. All right. Business continuity. So all the assets involved in critical business processes, the purchase of suitable insurance, safety of personnel, and formulate and document your continuity plans addressing your information security requirements in line with the agreed upon business continuity strategy. Is this really more of a policy kind of requirement here?
This one's all over the place. It's 4 different evaluative elements that go in totally different directions. You have one, which is you're identifying all the assets. So to me, that's like, did you do a business impact analysis? Have you done a risk assessment? But then it's like, oh, but by the way, then you go buy insurance, and then you get into
that you could, right?
Yeah.
That you say basically, hey, we're allowing you, in our business continuity strategy to purchase insurance against this.
Yeah. And then you get into 3, where it ensures the safety of personnel and the protection of information assets and organizational property. And that's kind of a arbitrary requirement. How do you really quantify that? Like, how do I quantify as an assessor whether or not an organization has ensured the safety of personnel and the protection of information assets? Yeah. Again, it kind of goes back to like, well, this is what we're doing. But I've had recent instances where HITRUST would come back on topics like this, where it's like, well, it didn't address personnel safety. And it's, for example, for maybe a data center customer. And I'm like, well, I looked at smoke detectors, I looked at locks, I looked at HVAC systems, I looked at protection of electrical equipment and transmission lines. That sure sounds like personnel safety to me. We haven't gotten to the point where we're looking for like, AEDs and first aid kits, but there's definitely that possibility. So
I've seen it. I've definitely seen like full on health and safety reports, all injuries reported, that type of thing. Everything from fire extinguishers to first aid kits.
There is
the whole
not
gamut.
This requirement, but there is another requirement in R2s that does speak a lot more directly towards personnel safety, and that's where I would expect to see it. And I think they use like the term that's like, I think it's either health safety or something, but it's one of those terms like overseas in the UK, that's a specific regulatory term. So,
because I worked in Scotland for 10 years, and I was doing HITRUST for a company that was both in Scotland and in the US, and that was the health and safety in the UK in general is a much more formalized situation.
And it's also similar in Canada. The way that they approach it is much more formal. Not that it's not in the States, but it's just a different flavor. It's a different flavor,
and it's different state by state.
Yeah, that's true as well. So, and then you also have, for example, within federal contracting world, you have things like the VPP and things like that. Yeah. But for the most part, in my view, this requirement gets a little tricky just because it goes in so many different directions. And if you don't address all of them, and then, for example, evaluate element 2, how do you prove that you considered something? Well, I typically expect to see it like in a risk assessment or some sort of meeting minutes. And if they can't prove that, like if they don't have insurance, so if they went and bought insurance, it's easy to determine if they considered it. But if they didn't buy insurance, how do they prove that they considered it? Unless you can see in a risk assessment or some management meeting.
Well, and the
super helpful.
Is,
those quarterly management meetings with good minutes.
Yep.
Well,
it's true.
The thing that strikes me is that this is all under the guise of business continuity and disaster recovery. So are they looking at this only in the context of that? Because a company may look at purchasing insurance, but not necessarily in the guise of for business continuity purposes or for disaster recovery purposes. Similar with the safety issues, because I know, physical and environmental safety is huge. We have a whole domain about it. But is this one for the safety of personnel who are maybe needing to travel to a different location, or in the event of a disaster, you're looking, at a way to have people notify you that they're safe and things like that, and that's kind of where this one to me seems like, to your point, it can be very broad.
Yeah.
And then the last one, data protection and privacy. So restrictions on the use of open source software. and then making sure it's legally licensed, authorized, and adheres. Now that's hard because you've got all these software engineers that want admin access to their development environments, and you can't control them to save your life. And they're not going to tell you, hey, by the way, I'm doing this. So this one I can imagine is a difficult one to pin down and get anybody to evidence that, yeah, that tool that we're using, the only way I found it you can effectively do it is you don't get admin access, and you have to ask permission of your boss or me, as the InfoSec person, to get any new widget that you want to put on in your development environment.
Yeah, there's a couple different angles to consider with this one. One of the most significant ones, when you think about it, application development, is the inclusion of open source packages as dependencies in your platform. And the reality is that this very quickly gets to the point where you need to be using some sort of software composition analysis tool to help you do license verification for open source software and all those kinds of things. So first of all, you have to have a policy in place, but then you have to have some mechanism to prove that you're doing evaluative elements 2 and 3, that it's legally licensed and that it's authorized. I had an audit last summer where one of the findings was we found that some product teams had gone out and they were buying third-party components that were being included in the software stack outside of the organization's vendor acquisition process. So they were literally just going out and expensing. They were purchasing it. They weren't using it illegally, but they were doing it outside of the organization's vendor management process. So the organization at a vendor management level had no idea that they had exposure associated with this vendor.
Yeah, and from an engineer's perspective, it's just a widget. Like, what's the harm? And you're like, eh.
It's just a widget until it's a lot more than a widget.
Exactly. All right. Well, this has been a super helpful walk through these top 10 gotchas, if you will, on a HITRUST assessment. So really appreciate, Richard. Hopefully you will be back for future topics and future sessions. And with that, we'll sign off.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye. Hey, thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. If you got value from this episode, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next HITRUST Secrets. We go live every Thursday at 2 p.m. Central and dig into real-world compliance and security topics. And each session gets uploaded right here after the live show. So whether you're catching us live or on your own time, make sure you're subscribed. We'd love to have you along on your HITRUST journey.